PA, Dr. Natalia to start the conversation.
Karibu. Warm greetings to everyone. Thank you to our online Facebook Live and Voices participants, and welcome to the latest in my series of 25 dialogues for the 25 years of ICPD. What's changed? I'm quoting Eleanor Roosevelt. Somewhere along the line of development, we discover what we really are, and then we make real decisions for which we are responsible. Make that decision primarily for yourself, because you can never really live anyone else's life, not even your child's. The influence you exert is through your own life and what you become yourself. End quote. So what an exciting week. The international delegations are gathered here at the United Nations headquarters for the 52nd session of the Commission on Population and Development. We're reviewing progress since the groundbreaking International Conference on Population and Development and the program of action that was adopted in Cairo in the year 1994. And at this milestone 25th anniversary, we do have much to celebrate. We're proud of UNFPA contributions to advancing the rights and choices of women, girls, and young people all around the world. And this Monday, we witnessed member states' adoption of a political declaration on population and development, reaffirming the Cairo program of action. That consensus declaration is a clear encouragement to us. That women's movement that resulted in the revolutionary Cairo consensus is re-energized. All roads lead to Nairobi in November and into the world of rights and choices for all that certainly lies ahead. So the excitement continues today with a distinguished panelist for this dialogue, and we're going to be informed, and I'm sure we're going to be challenged by three extraordinary human beings, women who dedicate their professional endeavors to bring to life the human rights and reproductive health universal access agenda for women and girls. Professor Radhika Balakrishnan is faculty director at the Center for Women's Global Leadership and professor in the Women and Gender Studies Department of Rutgers University. Her groundbreaking research and advocacy changed the lens through which macroeconomic policy is interpreted as a co-founder of the principles of feminist economics. Her seminal work on economic, social, and cultural rights involves applying international norms to assess economic policy, and her Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers established and leads the annual 16 Days Against Violence, Orange the World. And on this side, we have Dr. Joni Marlene Bewa, a medical doctor and public health researcher from République du Benin. And she is founder of the Young Beninois Leaders Association. Dr. Joni is also a United Nations Young Leader for the Sustainable Development Goals. And in fact, we met at the very exciting Goalkeepers event, co-sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation just last year. And she's been featured on Melinda Gates' list of 6 influential women promoting global access to contraception. We're delighted that you're with us. And we very warmly welcome back Professor Terry McGovern, who is the Heilbronn Professor and Chair of the Department of Population and Family Health at Columbia University, Mailman School of Public Health. And there, she leads health and human rights and environmental justice programs. Terry is a prominent human rights litigator. She founded the HIV Law Project and has served on the United States National Task Force on the development of HIV and AIDS drugs. As an alumni myself of the life-changing Cairo conference, I'm really happy to be here with you to learn from you. And I hope that we will hear something about your personal motivations as to how and why you're going to win big for sexual and reproductive health and rights. I'd like to thank our moderator for this What's Changed dialogue, UNFPA's own Dr. Jennifer Butler, who is our global coordinator for the Nairobi Summit, Accelerating the Promise of ICPD in November. And she's also coordinating our Golden Jubilee celebrations as UNFPA clocks 50 this year. You're in for a treat, so enjoy. Over to you, Jenny. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good morning and welcome, everybody, and thank you so much. We're going to jump straight into the questions, and we're going to ask the panelists the range of questions and then come to the audience. So Joanie, starting with you. Adolescent sexual reproductive health, very, very, very important area. The Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health in 2015, which Professor McGovern was a member of, really called for greater investments in adolescent health and pointing to the triple dividends that we get from having adolescents really getting the health services they need. So where are we? What do we need to do, as our executive director refers to, move the needle? What needs to happen, and how are we going to make it happen?
Thank you for the question. It's my pleasure and privilege to be here sharing the perspective about what can be done for adolescents and youth, but also acknowledge key achievements that has been done under ICPD. My work is local with the Young Beninese Leader Association in Benin, but also global, trying to push youth advocacy and participation with the UN Secretary General Envoy, Youth Envoy, and making sure that young people voices, but not just our voices, but also our need and our potential are used for the D in the P in the ICPD. There are three key principles that need to be acknowledged on the ICPD. First of all, we learned that we should not work anymore in silo. We should not work anymore in silo, and there is no room for business as usual. The second one is that people's rights and choice and well-being is the key driver for sustainable development. But last and not the least is that development needs to be people-centered. So how can we make sure that we leave no one behind? How can we make sure that we are inclusive? And when I talk about inclusivity, I'm looking at adolescents, I'm looking at youth, I'm looking at women, but I'm also looking at minorities and vulnerable people, the one that we call the voiceless. They are not voiceless, but they are just powerless. So to answer to your question more specifically, my work in Benin as an advocate, first of all, kind of help me to understand one thing. Adolescent has a specific need. It's a unique period that has specific needs, but also specific challenges, but also specific opportunities. My motivation, as Dr. Kanem was saying, having my best friend dying from abortion after unattended pregnancy, for me was a personal experience that I always ride with me, that makes me keep being committed for the work that we are all doing. But also personally, almost dying at 9 years old for an asthma attack, for me was the reasons to be committed for health. So we saw a lot of great improvement in terms of access, increase of access for young people and adolescents regarding family planning, regarding access to comprehensive sexuality education, but also regarding access to right. Unfortunately, we usually miss the R in SRHR. The right component is usually missed, but we also missed in terms of making sure that adolescents are not left behind. We also missed the U in UHC, the universal. So the adolescents in rural area with disability, those who are not in a formal healthcare system, how can we make sure to reach them despite the fact that there is comprehensive sexuality education in our educational system? The second aspect that I would like to raise is also the quality. Thank you. Oof, clear. The difference is so clear.
It's universal.
That should be universal. So the second point I would like to raise beside the access is the quality. There have been a couple of clinical standards for care, for adolescent care, that has been adopted recently on the continent on some regions. But how much they're implemented and for who and how. I think that's one question that needs to be addressed. But more importantly, adolescents are left behind because there is a continuum that needs to be addressed. Beside the healthcare need, we need to look at how can we keep the young girl or the adolescent in school so that she can have access to not only formal but also informal education. She can have the skill, the life skill that can help us to maybe negotiate condom or make the decision for her body, become economically independent, and be less at risk of issues such as HIV or unattended pregnancy. But also, most importantly, something that I would like to put an emphasis on is that in humanitarian area right now, adolescents and youth are the ones who are paying the heaviest and the biggest prices. And this should not continue because we saw progress that has been made under ICPD. We saw the commitment that has been made by government. We also saw progress that has been made in some regions. So we should not allow inequalities to still persist. The recent report of the World Economic Forum stated that we need 108 years to reach gender equality. So do you want the adolescent girl of today to wait 108 years to have access to education, to have access to health, to have access to her rights to be respected? Do we want my grandchildren to wait for that? I wouldn't want that. So I think those are alarming facts that exist, but we need to acknowledge that progress has been made. We need to acknowledge that success stories are out there and needs to be celebrated. But also, we need to look at gaps. And finally, because I don't want to keep the floor on just for myself, I would like to point out the fact that inequalities that exist are putting millions of girls at risk of so many issues. But the only way we can make sure that adolescent girls and youth voices are heard is to make sure that our potential, our innovation are actually on the table, not under the table or not out of the table. I think that is the first thing. The second thing is to make sure that there is integrations. There are a lot of programs that are successful, but the big challenge is how do we put in place that unique framework or that practical and solidified framework that take care of adolescent care as a continuum, from her sexual and reproductive health, her educational need, her mental needs, her right, etc. And that's the big challenge that we need to talk about. But also funding. There are a lot of programs that are funded, but most of them are put it under adults or youth, while adolescent health needs to have a specific budget line or specific attentions. So I think these are kind of idea that needs to be discussed about, and we cannot build the next generation today if we don't invest in the adolescent girl that in 2030 will be, maybe if she's 15 years now, 2030, she will be 25 years. So I think these are kind of issues that we need to look at, the approach that bring together healthcare, educational needs, right, access to employment, but also develop adolescent girl life skills, her self-esteem, her leadership and potential ability, but also consult her and adolescent and youth in designing program. That's basically what I can suggest.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, actually, we could spend the entire hour and a half just on this. It's brilliant. You've just perfectly articulated all the 5x5 things and accelerators for the Nairobi Summit, so I'm actually particularly thrilled about that. And I'm also very glad, in the UN, we live in the world of acronyms, and already we've had two. The U actually does mean universal, and the P actually does mean population, and the D actually does mean development. So speaking of development, Radhika, you're going to put the D into development as one of the champions and leaders around Cairo. It would be fantastic if you would talk a bit about what that D actually means. As a macroeconomist who really talks about social justice, who doesn't see macroeconomy as something that's about stock markets, but actually sees it as about people and its relationship to sexual reproductive health, we'd really like to hear your reflections from way back in 1994 25 years ago and what it actually means for how macroeconomics really fits into our SRHR world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me through this? Yes. Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. All right. When I was asked to, should I switch?
It's a relay.
Okay,
Just gonna
this is
pass the
better,
baton.
right? When I was asked to be on this panel, in reflecting on ICPD, I went and I sort of thought about, well, what did I think of ICPD? And it turns out that I actually wrote a short piece about what I thought of ICPD soon after ICPD and in the work. And so I want to just have a couple quotes from this piece that I wrote, I think in 1995 or 96. Though the Cairo document mostly reflects the crucial role that the women's movement had on ICPD, a particularly important role that needs further analysis is the connection between population and development. The document recognized that women's empowerment and improvement in status are important ends in themselves and essential to achieve the sustainable development. The development agenda, however, is narrow and does not reflect the progressive rhetoric of the rest of the document, in that economic growth, though in the context of sustainable developments, becomes the overriding principle. And to end, the next step for a feminist challenge is to question further assumptions to clarify the appropriate significance of the variable of population growth in addressing inequality and environmental degradation. And I think we're coming back to that moment again, 25 years later. And we need to be attentive to a global economic system that is in its structure of production removed from the interest of its members, and can only survive with a never-ending growth of consumption regardless of justifiable social needs. So that was something I wrote 25 years ago, and I think is very pertinent today. And so in terms of the D in ICPD, I remember that we had protests saying, where's the D in ICPD? I think one of the things that ICPD did was sort of de-link the idea that poverty was connected to population growth. And I think that was a really important dividend, and so that the demographic agenda was stopped. But I don't think we went from ICPD to Copenhagen, where we really thought that we were going to deal with the social economic issues, and then went to Beijing. And then we've kind of stalled in terms of that conversation. And I think we were talking about this, that after sort of the end of the Cold War, we thought we were going to be in a new development agenda that was cooperative and collective. And what we've gotten is a development agenda that is not cooperative and collective. And you talked about the Sustainable Development Goals and people being left behind. I'll quote my colleague Diane Nelson, who wrote, "It's not about people being left behind, but people being pushed behind." And that is the kind of economic policies that we're seeing. We're seeing unparalleled levels of inequality around the world. And I think Oxfam's last report was 42 people own the same wealth as half the world's population. That number was 388 in 2015. So it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller group of people that have it. But I think in terms of reproductive health, it's also the role of the state, as you brought up, in fulfilling human rights. So how do we think about the ways in which the role of the state is shrunk? The private sector is supposed to take up the role of the state, and I think we need to really question that. And the work that I've been doing for the last 10 years is really connecting the human rights framework to economic policy. And so if we say that we're all, here within the UN, and the UN, the overarching framework is the human rights framework, what does it have to say about economic policy? Can we conduct economic policy where the state is obliged to protect, fulfill, and respect rights? And if that is the role of the state, then what does it say about the kind of economic paradigm that we need to look at? And what is the role of the state in terms of using its resources to fulfill rights? I've been working a lot in terms of the the interpretation of the state using its maximum of available resources to fulfill economic and social rights. And usually what that means is that people look at budgets and say how much of it is going towards the fulfillment of rights. But it actually implies what are the kind of macroeconomic decision making you're making in order to come up with that budget. And where is that budget in terms of the role of adolescents and the rights of adolescents, and in terms of women's empowerment and how we have gender parity. If we have to wait 100 and how many ever years, I won't be here. So I'd like to see something happen, in my lifetime, which I don't think will happen. But I think we need to really, since the end of the Cold War, I think we really have stopped questioning the paradigm in a way that is fundamental. We need to fundamentally switch. I mean, when the credit rating agencies are telling us this level of inequality is unsustainable, we need to be worried, right? I mean, the IMF is saying this is not working. And so we need to really challenge that paradigm, and we need to challenge it in terms of, I think in terms of putting the rights of people forefront, and then having everyone decide what kind of economic world we want to, where people's rights are in the center. And the last thing, and I'll stop after that, the level of inequality is also showing up in the kind of right-wing movements around the world. Those don't come out of nowhere, and the democratically elected right-wing leaders are showing up every minute. And I think we need to connect that to the kind of economic policies we've been pursuing. They didn't come out of nowhere. It's not sort of personality driven. But unless we challenge it, and many of those, and I because I'm an academic and not at the UN, I can say this, but a lot of those governments are attacking women's rights. And women's sexual and reproductive rights in particular. And so if we're talking about 25 years from ICPD, we need to make all those links and connections so that we can see how we move forward.
Fantastic. Really, really well done. Thank you. Really. We've, as you all know, I'm not very good at Twitter. If I actually managed to understand what it was, not voiceless but powerless, and people being pushed behind, not left behind, I think is truly, truly extraordinary. So we've been talking about advocacy, services, the holistic approach, and emphasis on young people, and also the personal stories. We're actually talking about people. And Joanie, when you're talking about a trigger for you, a tipping point for you was something personal with your friend dying. These are real stories. These are real people. When you're talking, Radhika, it's not just a set of statistics. And as you said, when IMF and so on start to get worried, when the credit agencies get worried, they know that underpinning that is actually a real threat and concern to what's going to happen to the lives of people for agencies, organizations that's not normally dwelling and living in that world of what's happening to the individual. Now it is. But for Terry, you're a lawyer. And ever since, but seriously, since 1989, you started the incredibly transformative role of ensuring that women had access to AZT when it was still experimental, when it was seen that women didn't have access to that. You've pushed the boundaries again and again and again of how the law is imperative to ensuring fundamental rights of women's access and the access of adolescent girls to the services that they need and deserve. So from your perspective, taking a longitudinal view, what do we need to be doing? What is the shift that needs to occur, age of consent and so on, to really make a significant shift in access, service and quality availability through the law?
That's a big question. First of all, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here with this panel. I think progress has happened, but it's also been uneven, and I would say the law has a big part in that. And just to go back to this personal theme, I was going to be a poverty lawyer in 1987 in New York City, and women were coming in who were HIV positive, but they were dying before they ever could get Medicaid because the US government was using an AIDS definition that that was based on studies that weren't looking at what was happening to women, wasn't looking at converging epidemics. So I got a very early lesson in global health governance, that global health governance may actually only respond to the people with the most power, and not like anybody in HIV had much power at all. So this is relative powerlessness, but I was seeing women die of AIDS, but we had to litigate. So we filed the class action and changed the definition. But at the same time, I was getting women who were coming in who were being banned from the DDI trials, from the early trials, because they were of childbearing potential. And this was all in response to thalidomide in the US. The FDA had created a guideline that said women of childbearing potential could be banned from the early phases of clinical trials. So what I learned in doing those cases was that it wasn't even that people knew this particular drug could hurt women. It was kind of across the board classification. So we were able to get those things fixed, but I guess those were big lessons on the intricacies and the impact of law. So just very quickly, when you think about it, law impacts. If you're a climate refugee, you don't have legal status, so you can't access health care. If you're criminalized, you're LGBT, you're a sex worker, you often can't access health care. Of course, in the area of adolescence, we get into all kinds of issues with third-party consent, parents, guardians, husbands. So let me just say a little bit about this. So I think we've made great strides, and you look at all the countries who've ratified CEDAW or have agreed to ICPD, but it's in the detail. The devil's in the details. So basically, many countries, as you all well know, take reservations or they domesticate the laws in ways that protect existing customary religious laws. And this often has really bad consequences for adolescents. We just did an analysis of Nigeria, the 14 states that have religious customary law versus the civil law states. And in fertility, family planning, maternal child health, the outcomes were starkly worse in the areas that had religious customary law. So it's not enough for a country to actually just ratify or agree to these international agreements. We often have to go way further and figure out how to work with local leaders, incentivize compliance with domestic laws that give people access, that's precisely give adolescents access to services. So just to touch on the third rail of abortion, we all know that where abortion is illegal, abortion is unsafe. That's a law issue. You mentioned humanitarian sector. The humanitarian sector often acts as though abortion is illegal, even in countries where it's not illegal. So there's only really 6 countries where abortion is totally outlawed. And when you start thinking about adolescence and sexual violence and the huge numbers of the related maternal mortality, particularly among young girls, related to sexual violence, these issues really become quite important, and we have to get much more precise and much more, frankly, do a lot more advocacy to make sure that laws are being applied correctly. So it is international human rights law that should apply in the humanitarian sector, and adolescent girls should be able to get abortions. So I think if you're asking me what I think we need to do, I think what Natalia said is correct. We have the hardest stuff left to do, and that's going to require us to be extremely strategic and touch some of these issues in ways that we haven't often been able or willing. The science is there. This is not an evidence issue. This is an ideology issue, and I think we really have to figure out ways to shift things.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So We have some second round of questions, but I'm actually watching the faces of the people in the room, and I'm metaphorically watching the faces of the people on screen. So with your permission, I'd actually like to open up the floor because it's been so incredibly fascinating that I know there are a number of colleagues that would really like to ask some questions. So Jacqueline, while we're waiting for questions from the floor, from the out there in space, in the country opposites, may I ask for one or two questions from inside the room?
We have one over there.
Is there? Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to just come over here to Annika first, and then we get the mic over here.
Good morning. I'm Annika Knutsson. I'm heading the Sexual and Reproductive Health branch here. So my question is kind of general, and let me first thank you for this. This was so inspiring. And I was particularly happy to hear Joni's outline because it's really the 5 streams that we're planning for Nairobi to in the program. Never mind. Now, my question is, if you look at UNFPA as an actor in this field, I would like to hear your challenge to us. Not going just into Nairobi, but beyond. What can we do more? And what do you see there is potential, considering the climate we're in, considering all that is at stake? So I would like to hear from all of you. Thank you.
Thanks,
We'll take
Annika.
another question.
And
from this
Johnny,
side?
we don't have 5 hours to answer that extremely
Yeah.
complicated question.
Okay.
Good morning. My name is Marta Diavova, and I work in the regional office in Istanbul. So I'm delighted to be here at headquarters during this conversation. And thank you for this journey. It really was fascinating, from the personal story, economic, and 1994 talk to the ideology challenge. So my question to you is, we have been operating in decades where the rights, the choices, the evidence were our argument. And obviously heading Nairobi and afterwards to finish the most difficult part of the agenda, we need to do something differently. Having said all these phenomenal stories which are driving our narrative and our lives to be committed to what we are doing, what will be the 3 things we need to leave in the past and the 3 things we need to take forward to make this success story for the world? Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. We have over here Danielle, and then we come over to you, of course. I'm just waiting to get a microphone to you.
Yes, hello. I'm Danielle Engel. I'm working in the Adolescent News team in Sexual and Reproductive Health branch with Annika. And my question is, Cairo came about with a lot of passion and a lot of energy from the civil society and from the activists in '94, 25 years ago. We have now younger generations who have not yet been born in '94. So how can we make sure that the fire of Cairo is continuing to burn in the hearts and minds of the younger generations?
Okay. And last one over here.
I don't know. Yes? Okay. My name is Sarah. I work at Technical Division headquarters. I have a question for Radhika. We did an analysis for the CPD now that's happening. We ran an analysis of 25 years of indicators of the ICPD. And we also, of course, found that inequalities have worsened. And on the other hand, there is another finding that the discrimination has increased to some extent based on World Values Survey. So I wanted you just to explore a little bit of these if there's any linkages between these 2 issues, because it seems to me that there's some, to some extent, if we don't touch one, we don't solve the other, maybe.
Thanks, Sarah. And can we have the mic over there? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this is really a great discussion, and we are going to fall short of time anyway. So I just want to go back to the question of ideology. So I think if you want to talk about changing ideology, I think we need to really innovate our minds and change the perception. So my question to the panel is, how do you think that we should go about it? Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll take have an attempt at answering some of these questions now. But they're fantastic questions, and they're actually wonderful because we won't get all of them done now, but it's a thinking. And what I love about Nairobi is our road to Nairobi is a series of these conversations for us to really be using it as an opportunity to have these discussions and to co-create, to do the thinking. So let's just start first with Marta's question, but instead of 3, just 1. If you could each say 1, sorry, Marta, but the liberty of the floor. Terry, one thing that we would keep, one thing that you would take forward.
From Nairobi. From the ICPD originally?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was wasting time to think. So a lawyer trick.
Well, so having heard you talk, I actually don't think that's possible.
I think. So I would say, of course, we need to the leadership from directly affected women and girls has to be kept. What was the other part? What should we leave behind?
Yes.
Gatekeepers.
Broadly defined. Okay.
There's many people who keep young leaders from actually ever having any power, entering the spaces. I think we need to interrogate how we use power, share power.
Fantastic. That's wonderful. Radhika.
Okay, that gave me the few minutes that I needed to think. I'm going back to my article again, and I was like, well, I think the thing we keep is the delinking of population and development, and I think that one we would never let that come back. Whatever the environmental movement tries to push it back in terms of demographic dividend, we keep that from ICPD. And I actually want to agree with the gatekeeper issue, but also a little bit in terms of the civil society. I'm kind of breaking rules, but I think one of the things that's happened over the years is there's been such closing of space for civil society to engage in the UN system. I teach a course every spring called Feminist Advocacy at the United Nations, and I bring, a group of students to the CSW. It's been years since they've been able to even hear the negotiations, and I make them read all the papers, and they're going, and they can't get in. And that wasn't the thing. So if we want to talk about how do we energize civil society to participate, let them in. And I think that's what we need to do.
Thank you. Joni.
I think I agree on what has been said. And something we can do differently is to look at more adolescent and youth-friendly policies, system, framework, and funding mechanism. Something that we need to change is maybe our traditional way of working and our collective fear of not taking risk and being vulnerable.
Fantastic, really good. Annika's question about challenges, I think is a very deep and longer question. If you have any quick responses to challenges, I've heard about 100 so far this morning in a few minutes. So just a quick reflection. Johnny, what would be the number one challenge that you think we face?
For UNFPA.
UNFPA.
Okay, one challenge that, my engagement with UNFPA West and Central Africa office and Eastern ISARO office, I didn't see a major challenge, however, improvements in terms of human capacity development for young people and making sure that, the one in rural area, the one who doesn't have formal education average, there are great programs that are being done out there, but we need to reach the powerless. Yeah.
Okay. Radhika?
It's a difficult question to say what the challenge is. I would say because UNFPA has country offices that do programmatic work, that is a really important space that UNFPA holds that many UN agencies don't have. And so to put a feminist agenda in the center of that work, I think is the challenge. And I think, and I'm not saying you're not doing it, but to make it really center and become a part of the program of UNFPA would be the challenge.
guess
Terry.
I would say in these very difficult areas, maybe figuring out a way to incentivize compliance with international human rights law or civil law, using money, whatever, to get some movement in these areas that have such bad law.
Yeah, great. And we didn't yet address the question of ideology, but it's a very, very serious. No, but it's a really, really serious one, and I think it's complicated. It's a great question, but I think the way that you articulated it, Terry, was extremely good. And Radhika, your piece from 1994, 1996 shows that many of the challenges then are still present. And in fact, because we're in such a different political and global economic environment, different global political environment, it really makes it incredibly important that we have these very detailed discussions around how we make the ideological changes. Yesterday, we had a very good meeting with civil society, and it was so interesting because it was a very broad range of civil society, and they have quite different ideological stands on many, many different components of the ICPD agendas. So there isn't a homogeneous view of where it is that we need to go in terms of that ideological challenge. But would you, any of the three of you, like to put your toe in the water of just quickly addressing the ideological issue? That was a very resounding yes. Okay. I'm going to do that right now.
I mean, I will say I was in Ireland, actually, which Ireland is very different from many of the countries in the world. But there was the young people there were doing this campaign. I can't remember. It was like talk to your grandmother, whatever. So I actually, in the most conservative parts, witnessed these young people having conversations with their elders, where they were actually talking about maternal mortality, pointing out people had died and making connections to how this related to this vote to repeal the prohibition on abortion. And I really saw a kind of movement in those conversations that I haven't seen in a long time. So I think youth are key to shifting ideology.
Yeah, I want to agree with Terry. I went to the climate march organized by the youth 2 weeks ago. It was in 126 countries at the same time. And the leadership was 17 years old. And I mean, I was at Columbus Circle and there were 12-year-old kids. And there, the ideology, I mean, it's getting back to the ideology, is they had a very comprehensive ideology. And they were talking about climate change. They were talking about the rights of people. I mean, they had a moment of silence for the atrocities in New Zealand. And so it was a really comprehensive ideology, and I'm hoping that we do that. And then in terms of ideology, I mean, what we see now is sort of people who are supposed to hate each other all get together when it comes to women's rights. And they all go have coffee when they're trying to get rid of language on women's rights. But at the same time, we're also seeing, no, it's really true. I won't name the countries, but we all know who they are. But then on the other hand, we're also seeing feminist leadership increasing. In terms of the United States, in terms of who got elected in the House, the leadership in New Zealand. I mean, we're seeing more and more feminists being elected into leadership. And so I'm hopeful that that's a move globally and that we're not going back to more right-wing patriarchs winning.
Joanie?
Very briefly, I want to agree with that and go one step further and talk about intergenerational dialogue we between seasoned leader but also young people, because we cannot build a next generation if we don't have this transition. But also talking about transition plan from adolescent to youth and youth to adulthood, and finally empower. I think the ideology behind bringing aid, but also empowering the beneficiaries to become actors, to be empowered, and youth and adolescents especially to dare and take more leadership position, either in civil society or politics or private sector, should be a very great end goal.
Fantastic, thank you. I'd like to ask our Executive Director, Dr. Natalia Kanem, to come back and join us.
Thank you, Jenny. Look, we have had the benefit of some of the best thinking about fundamental issues that not just affect UNFPA or the United Nations, but really touch the lives of women, girls, boys, men, young people in villages and towns and communities all around the world. And the issues are germane. These are not abstract things. These are things that really help to shape our effectiveness and our impact. Just yesterday, UNFPA joined the High Commissioner for Human Rights and UNAIDS and other arms of the United Nations in asking for repeal of criminal laws against adult consensual sexual conduct and decisions on reproduction, and the implementation of laws to protect all people from violence and protect all people from discrimination, and to ensure that adequate health services, including SRHR services, would be accessible and affordable and acceptable to address the needs of people who might be affected by a highly discriminatory penal code. So I think, in our every action, we have to think about how do we defend the notion that the cycle of life is for everyone, that the traversing of that road from adolescence into adulthood doesn't mean that you have to be quiet as a girl. It means that your voice should be encouraged. It means you should have the confidence to shout from the highest hilltop what your interests, your ideas, and your demands are. So really knowing how distinguished this panel is and how much pressure there is on your time, as we walk this road to Nairobi, we want to thank you for engaging with us. As you know, the Cairo conference was a formal UN conference for negotiating texts, et cetera, et cetera. We've had our success this week, so that is not what Nairobi will be about. It will be a forum for us to strategize and work together on the next 25 years of this, hopefully, life-changing agenda. Thank you again very much to all of you. Signing off now.
Yeah, thanks to all. We'll see you at the next conversation.
Thank you.